Good morning. This is Sunday, June the 24th. And I'm Ron, and welcome to Storytime. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And yes, this is Ron, your conservative host, the only true conservative in the United States of America, and speaking to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. So, Rush Limbaugh always talks about how he knows these people, and these people I'm sure he's referring to the left, like every square inch of his glorious naked body. I believe that's a quote because I've heard it like hundreds and hundreds of times. But anyways, and he doesn't. He doesn't know diddly squat about the left, really. So the people that know about the left are the people that have lived it. They've either been in a lefty family, or they have grew up in maybe a conservative household, but they went left and joined various organizations like Tammy Bruce. I don't know if Tammy Bruce's family was conservative, but she became lefty more or less when she was an adult. She joined feminist groups and organizations and was politically active as a lefty. So she understands the left. She was part of it. And people like me, because I grew up in a foster home with lefties. And I mean hardcore. Now, what was interesting about these lefties is they would never once, not once, during the whole time I was with them like 12 years, not once did they come out and mention Karl Marx. Did they come out and mention the Capitalist Manifesto? They were never overt about their leftist leanings, but you could tell afterwards. After I grew up, then a lot of things clicked when I started studying about Marxism and capitalism and all that stuff. Then everything, my experiences in this foster home start to make sense. Start going, oh, okay, the light goes on. I know what's going on here. So but they were hardcore lefties. My foster mother was the really the hardcore lefty. Her husband was he more or less just went along with the program, but she was a hardcore lefty, and she hated the United States of America. She hated this country. She's eventually got to go home and live in Holland, and I'll tell you that story. It's like justice, some serious street justice or poetic justice, but she got to go home, and good riddance to bad rubbish. Because all she ever did was complain about this country. If you did something that was an American, or you acted like an American or whatever, then you get this snotty, sneering, "Oh, that's so American," like it's the dirtiest thing on the face of the earth. When I was playing Pop Warner football, and I had my uniform on to go to practice, she wouldn't be in the same room with me. Literally, wouldn't be in the same room with me. She says, I won't be in the same room with him while he's wearing that monkey suit. And at the time, I'm like, what the hell is wrong with this woman? But now it all makes sense. You're a hardcore lefty. You don't want to be reminded of America, the home of the free and the home of the brave and the home of the brave and the free. Let's put it that way. So, and capitalism, the home of capitalism. You don't want to be reminded of that at all. So, now my foster father, he was, again, he just went along with the program. He loved baseball. He loved jazz. He thought it was fabulous. She couldn't stand either one of them because they were American, not because they weren't valid pastimes or valid entertainment, but simply because they were American, and America stood for capitalism. And she was always homesick for Europe and homesick for Holland. And there's a lot of times when I was thinking to myself, then good, get the hell out of here. Who needs you? Who wants you? But for instance, one of the things that manifested themselves in terms of being socialist was their attitude toward money. I always thought that they were just cheap, extremely cheap people. And now I look back on it and realize, no, they didn't spend money because they figured that it was always an attempt to get people, to separate people, a capitalist plot to separate people from their money. For instance, when we go on vacations, and of course we didn't, we always went on more or less busman's holidays is really kind of the way I look at it, because we'd go camping. It was always camping. We wouldn't go anywhere and stay in a hotel. Oh no. Oh God, no. That's capitalist. And, that's just some capitalist plot to separate you from your money. Hotels were invented just to screw you. That's all there is to it. We don't need a hotel. We'll sleep in a tent, you know, that kind of thing. So on the way, and they didn't want to go a lot of times nearby, I mean, maybe go up to Big Bear or something of that nature. No, 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 no. We got to go to Sequoia, Kings Canyon. We live in, at the time, is Alhambra. So it's like an 8-hour drive just to get to the mountains, and then another hour or so winding our way up and getting through and then finding our camping spot and all that stuff. So it was an ordeal, an absolute ordeal to go on vacation. Then, after you spent 8 hours, 9 hours, 10 hours in a car with the dog who didn't like being in the car, would drool all over the place. Then you go through all that. Then when you get there, now we got to pitch a tent and get all the camping stuff set up so that we're ready to go. So again, it was just the whole exercise was rather grueling. But anyways, and they did it because they're not going to spend money. They're not going to go to a hotel, and then on our way up there, of course, you're going to get hungry. They're not going to stop at a restaurant. Of course not. Restaurants are capitalist plots to separate people from their money. That's all there is to it. So what she's going to do is make sandwiches. So you're thinking, okay, well, I can live with that. It doesn't have to be a restaurant, a good hearty sandwich, yeah, that'll work. No, 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 no. No, we're not talking Dagwood Bumstead here. We're talking about 2 slices of bread, margarine, not butter, and 1 deli thin slice of meat and 1 thin slice, and or actually that's the way it was. She didn't even put the cheese and the meat together. You could have a cheese sandwich or you could have the meat sandwich. And the meat sandwich was 1 deli thin slice of meat. And between 2 pieces of bread and margarine, not butter, because again, butter was a capitalist tool or whatever. Somehow it was, I guess, a capitalist tool because they just wouldn't go for butter. And so there you go. You got your crappy little sandwich. You get to go through this whole ordeal, including the crappy lunch. And if you fussed about it and got kind of annoyed over the fact that you're getting a crappy sandwich and having to travel for 8 hours with a car sick dog and all that, then of course they give you dirty looks or slap you around. You get into the corporal punishment time. Because they weren't going to put up with that. I mean, they were outraged at the drop of a hat, especially my foster mother. So, and then of course there was the famous incident, the one that really the first told me, hey, this woman's definitely a socialist, because socialists they don't care, they don't want to make everybody rich, they want to make everybody even, fair, and usually they're going to use the lowest common denominator. So my sister came home from school, and this was, I think, junior high, 7th grade. And our foster mother says to her, your foster sister has been complaining that she doesn't have as many friends as you do, because the foster sister just wasn't as popular. It wasn't that she was a bad kid. She just wasn't as popular as my sister was. So my foster mother again said, then, the fact that you have more friends than she does is not fair. Is not fair. So you are going to have to get rid of, I can't remember what the number was, but she had to get rid of 3, 4, or 5 of her friends. And I remember that my sister was distraught. She was crying and sobbing, because can you imagine that? You're in the 7th grade and you got to go and tell 4 or 5 of your friends, I'm sorry, I can't be your friend anymore. Why not? Well, because you want to have to go into that explanation? Because it doesn't make any damn sense. Instead of teaching her daughter how to be more popular, how to be more social, she instead tells my sister to get rid of 3 or 4 of her friends. Cruel, with a capital C, maybe all capital letters. And she did it in a very business-like way, as though, of course, that's what you're going to do. Of course you're going to cut down the number of friends, because of course the objective is to be fair. And we heard fair, fair, fair all the time. This isn't fair. That's not fair. Fair, 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 fair. This has got to be fair. No, it doesn't have to be fair. It's not. That's not necessarily the issue, or it's not always the issue. And that's what again told me later on in life. At the time, I just thought I felt sorry for my sister. I thought, "Phew, man, I wouldn't want to be in your position." But later on, when I started understanding politics and whatnot, and I remembered that incident, I thought, bingo, socialist all the effing way. So, and they were cheap about. Another one was if you had a headache, and normally if you had a headache and you're complaining to your parents that this hurts or that hurts or you have a headache, what's your parents going to do? Take an aspirin. Go take an aspirin. No, 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 not here, not my foster home. No, they were like, oh no, wait a while, wait a while. Then they tried to tell you it's because you don't want to. It's better for you that way somehow. But they didn't give a damn about whether it was better for me. What they wanted to do was, again, the whole idea of aspirin was to separate people from their money. You don't need aspirin. That was the other thing with them, is that everything had to be natural. Natural, natural, natural. Why? Because natural, in their mind, is non-capitalist. That only the things that are not natural, however they care to define it, is capitalism. So again, the same thing with the aspirin. If you go out and take an aspirin, that's not natural, and their frame of reference for natural was, I guess, the cavemen. What would a caveman do? Some people ask, what would Jesus do? These people asked, what would the cavemen do? So and in this case, they say, well, they wouldn't have had aspirin back in the caveman days. No, but they might have had opium poppies. Who knows, right? They would have had, might have had good understanding of medicinal plants and herbs, and maybe had an even more effective solution for aches and pains than we do today. Who knows? But she assumes that back in the caveman days, you got a headache, you roughed it out, you toughed it out. Okay, so that was her standard was if they didn't have it in the caveman days, then we shouldn't bother with it here. And then also one of the other ultimate things was when I got hit in the face with the baseball, lost 2 pints of blood, and lost the 2 pints of blood because of my foster mother. When I got hit in the face with the baseball, I got taken to the emergency room. My nose was stitched up. It had been cracked, and the bone was broken, and then they packed my nostrils full of gauze, and then it wouldn't stop bleeding. So it has nowhere else to go except down the back of my throat, and so it would pool in my stomach until I got sick enough, nauseated enough to throw it up. So I'd be on the couch, and my foster mother would just put a 5-gallon bucket next to me. I'd barf in the bucket, and she would very efficiently and dutifully get the bucket, dump it out, wash it out, and bring it back. But any other parent watching their child barfing pure blood would have immediately said, oh no, this isn't going to be happening, and either is going to call 911 or at the very least call the doctor. No, not my foster mother, because again, doctors and hospitals are capitalist plots to separate folks from their money. No, we can handle this naturally. We'll just let it sort of blow over. We'll tough it out until the bleeding stops. Well, 3 days later, the bleeding hadn't stopped, and I was on the verge, as close to death as as I've ever been. She finally decided I didn't look so good, called the doctor. She comes back into the room and she says, doctor wants to know if you feel tingling in your fingers and your toes. And I said, no, I feel it all over my body, which is the truth. It would start in my head, and this tingling sensation would run the entire length of my body. And so the next thing I know, I'm being bundled up, stuffed in the car. We go to the doctor's office. This is in the days before HMOs and all that BS, when doctors were doctors. So you go to the doctor's office. He took one look at me and said, nope, he's going into the hospital. So I got to spend 2 or 3 weeks in the hospital getting blood transfusions, all because my foster mother was a dogmatic socialist. Okay, and a lot of what's going on in Venezuela today is a similar thing where people are suffering in Venezuela needlessly. There are countries around the world, including the United States, that are willing and able to give aid, to give medicines, to give food, to give whatever the Venezuelan people need to keep them afloat. And the Venezuelan government won't do it. They won't accept it. They keep pretending that the plight of the Venezuelan people is a plot by the United States of America against Venezuela because Venezuela went socialist. So that was exactly the same kind of thinking my foster mother had. So, but like I said, last I'd heard, she finally, she went back to Holland for a visit, told her husband, guess what? I'm not coming back. I want a divorce. And she got to spend the next 2 years homeless. This is a woman that's a Dutch citizen, and she's living in Holland, and she can't find a place to live because she was always bugging her husband. "Hey, let's go back to Holland. Go back to Holland." He said, "Okay, well, let's give it a shot." So they go back for a visit, and they come back because he said there's no work, there's no jobs for him in Holland, and there's no place to live. There's no place to live. So, and here she was, a Dutch citizen. I guess there wasn't any welfare or whatever. And her and her youngest daughter spent 2 years. And basically, what they would do is they would um, house sit. So, if somebody was going on vacation for a month, then they would house sit, and that was the only way they had a place to live and food in their mouth and all that stuff. It took them 2 years to get their own place and to really get settled and established. So, and as far as I'm concerned, she got what she deserved, as my grandmother used to say. Okay, so when I come back, I'm going to be reading from the Anglican Theological Review. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I am going to continue on with the Anglican Theological Review, Fall 2017, Volume 99, Number 4. And this is the first chapter called Theological Interpretation, Second Naivete. And this is the last section, and it's titled Theological Interpretation of the Story of Cain and Abel. It may be helpful to conclude with a fuller example of how readers today can rediscover the Old Testament through theological interpretation in second naivete mode. The story of Cain and Abel in Genesis 4, verses 1 through 16. In historical critical terms, it is a rich and challenging text. The story shows clear signs of an internal tradition history. Although the narrative is set at the very beginnings of life on earth with only a handful of people alive, the story's own logic presupposes the regular conditions of a populated earth, that is, the world of ancient Israel. There is the differentiation of labor, with Abel as a shepherd and Cain as a farmer. For chapter 4, verse 2. Sacrifice as a practice is taken for granted, chapter 4, verses 3 through 4. And Cain's anxiety that as a restless wanderer he may be murderously picked off, chapter 4, verse 14, envisages the role of the nomad vagrant on the fringes of settled communities. Presumably, the story has been adapted to its present location because it illustrates something fundamental about life on Earth. The story of rivalry between two brothers who are probably twins in chapter 4, verses 1 through 2, Eve bears twice but only conceives once. A rivalry that leads to fratricide resonates with the story of Romulus and Remus, a paradigmatic narrative for ancient Rome, and poses the issue of the deep divisions that can come between those who may, in family terms, be closest to each other. But how should the story best be read? Although modern scholars have often wanted to see the story as a window onto ancient sociological tensions between farmers and shepherds, or between the inhabitants of an arable land, say the central hill country of Canaan, and inhabitants of the desert, say the Negev, or between Israelites and Kenites, Such issues at best lie in the background. The story itself poses a clear issue that challenges all readers. How should one understand the Lord's differential response to the sacrifices of Abel and Cain, which is unexplained by the narrator, and which sets in motion Cain's murder of Abel and his subsequent interaction with the Lord? One's decision here is likely to shape the reading of all that follows. Despite the silence of the narrator, the working assumption of most readers from antiquity until now is that there must be a good reason for the Lord's rejection of Cain's sacrifice, and that this reason must be somewhere in the text. Although many possible reasons have been proposed, probably the most common option is to see Cain's offering as inferior to Abel's. In other words, Cain offered second best to God, and part of the moral of the story is that this will not do. This construal is finally expressed by Nahum Sarna. The reason for God's different reactions may be inferred from the descriptions of the offerings. Abel's is characterized as being the choicest of the firstlings of his flock. Cain's is simply termed as coming from the fruit of the soil, without further detail. Abel appears to have demonstrated a quality of heart and mind that Cain did not possess. Thus, the narrative conveys the fundamental principle of Judaism that the act of worship must be informed by genuine devotion of the heart. One can see essentially the same interpretive move in the New Testament, where we read that by faith Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain's. Hebrews 11, chapter 11, verse 4. That is, Abel in his offering displayed the prime quality of responsiveness to God that Christians call faith, and that Cain was from the evil one and murdered his brother, because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. 1 John chapter 3, verse 12. That is, Cain's disposition and actions, presumably the sacrifice as well as the murder, were wrong, while Abel's were right. Such a construal makes excellent moral and theological sense. It encapsulates an important truth of both Jewish and Christian faiths, and makes the story readily accessible. This is a meaningful theological interpretation, and an imaginative preacher should have no difficulty in relating it to life today. Nonetheless, the fact that this reading is attested in the New Testament and regularly in Christian tradition, and so has a certain obvious authority for Christian faith, does not make it the only significant theological reading. An alternative approach is to return to the initial crux and to resist rationalizing the Lord's preferential decision, instead seeing its inexplicable nature as integral to the point of the story. Such an interpretive move is rooted in the desire to hear the text's own voice, even when it is surprising. Two considerations support this move. One is the narrative analogy with other twins in Genesis, Esau, and Jacob, where a preferential decision, the elder shall serve the younger, is made while they are still in Rebekah's womb, Genesis chapter 25, verse 23. And so neither Jacob nor Esau can have done anything to deserve being differently favored. The other fact is the extent in life generally to which people are differently favored for no reason of what they have done. Two things that matter greatly, intelligence and beauty, are differentially given from one mother's womb. Likewise, people can encounter injustice, poverty, ill health, failure, or premature death for no reason related to anything they have done to deserve such things. For many people, especially those in unfavored situations, the challenge to handle such situations well without being scarred or destroyed by them can be a prime issue of life. A rationalizing question, what have I, you, they done to deserve this, leads nowhere. Rather, the fruitful question is to look forward and to ask, given this situation, what might be made of it? Jesus' words about the man born blind illustrate this stance perfectly in John chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. This is the nature of the Lord's words to Cain, chapter 4, verse 7. Their interpretation is not easy, but the basic point appears to be that Cain, angry at being unfavored in relation to Abel, is going to be confronted by sinful, bitter resentment, which will be like a wild animal wanting to destroy him. But you must master it. Cain retains a choice. In the event, Cain ignores these words and allows his resentment to have its way when he kills Abel. Later in Genesis, Esau also, like Cain, is unfavored. He is the elder who will have to serve the younger. He is also cheated out of his birthright by Jacob's brazen deception of the dying Isaac. Initially, Esau simply wants to kill Jacob as soon as Isaac is dead. Chapter 27, verse 41. So Jacob leaves home. When, after many years, he returns, he becomes increasingly apprehensive about what Esau will do. Will he still be murderously resentful? Yet, when the brothers meet, Esau welcomes Jacob graciously and tearfully. Esau, unlike Cain, has mastered the wild beast of resentment and shown how deep disappointment can be well handled. It is a pity that in the history of Jewish and Christian interpretation, Esau has regularly been given a bad press, as for example, typifying Rome as an oppressor of Jews, rather than being recognized as a memorable exemplar. The second naivete reading of Cain and Abel respects and values the New Testament's reading of the story, and yet prefers a different reading that more likely captures the intrinsic concern of the ancient Hebrew narrative. By probing the issue of how to handle being unfavored in God's world, and by underlining that to choose how to respond is an intrinsic part of being human. It addresses a theological and existential issue of perennial significance. Insofar as Christians neglect the Old Testament, they do so to their own imaginative and moral and spiritual impoverishment. And that concludes that first chapter. And the next chapter that I'll be reading starting next week is Theological Interpretation of Scripture and Its Future by Stephen Fowle. I'm reading this because this is basically these kinds of books. They're review books. You can find philosophy reviews and book reviews and all that stuff. And they're scholarly. They're very scholarly. People that with master's degrees and PhDs submit articles for these books. And I love them because they're very conceptual, very abstract, and hence very modern. And that they have, even if you don't understand all of the words in what's being said, it has a nice rhythm to it. I really appreciate how well written it is. It's almost poetic, or I suppose I should say prosaic. And so that's one of the reasons I read it. And the other one is as a contrast to the left's preferred choice of communication, which is storytelling and verbal picture painting, as represented by the stories that I've been reading out of a book called the Sun Stories, which are basically tribal peoples' lore, legend, and stories. In this case, all about the sun and how the sun becomes personified, becomes like a person. And but anyways, it shows that the difference between the two. There is a certain poetry as well to the storytelling in the sun stories, but again, it's you can see or hear the difference in terms of modern versus primitive. And it is that because the left constantly says that we're going forward and that they want to move us forward, when in reality, what they spend most of their time trying to move us backward, especially if they're getting us to try to communicate on a regular basis as our main means of communicating by telling stories and by verbal picture painting. So, when I come back, I'm going to be reading from the Black Book of the American Left. Okay, thank you very much. And now I'm going to be reading from the Black Book of the American Left, David Horowitz. And I'm reading it's a very long introduction. And so I've concluded part one of the introduction, and this is part two. And most of it's kind of an autobiographical thing. David Horowitz, is in the Tammy Bruce camp in that he was born, he called himself a red diaper baby. But he was born to socialist or communist parents and grew up in the left. But he got to a point where he had doubts. He started having doubts, and in working through those doubts, realized that the left was not the place to be, and he ended up becoming a conservative. And so these books, the Black Books of the American Left, is telling how the left operates, how it thinks, and also some autobiographical parts for where he got to the point where he had his split with the left and how he was treated by the left after he became a conservative. So here we go with part two. The essays that make up the second part of this volume begin with Goodbye to All That, our swan song to the left. The article was published by the Washington Post under the title Lefties for Reagan and was our formal coming out as conservatives, although it was based on second thoughts that have been gestating since the mid-70s. The next two essays, My Vietnam Lessons and Semper Fidel, belong to this genre, and are attempts I made to confront our radical cohort with the harsh realities of what we had actually done. Vietnam was the defining issue of our generation, but the events that unfolded proved that those of us who were active in the anti-war movement had been wrong on every critical point, and that our actions had tragic consequences for the people we claimed to be defending. My decision to vote for Ronald Reagan and join the conservative cause was also inspired by events in Nicaragua, where Castro Marxists had seized power through a political coup. Semper Fidel, originally titled A Speech to My Former Comrades on the Left, was about those events. It was given at a conference organized by Berkeley radicals who probably didn't realize what they were in for and who shut off my microphone before I could finish. Following the appearance of our Post article, Peter and I were repeatedly forced to defend our conservative views. Keepers of the Flame is one of those defenses, written following our return from a trip to Nicaragua and in response to a review of Destructive Generation that appeared in The New Republic. The essay reflects our continuing effort to understand what had happened to us, not only why we weren't welcomed into what we thought would be the political center, but also why our anti-communist politics were treated with such hostility by the liberal press. The review that provoked our response was written by Paul Berman, who insinuated that the sins we described in Destructive Generation were basically our own and did not reflect the general behaviors or attitudes of the left. This attempt to revise the past was a common tack of the leftists we now faced. In Carl Bernstein's Communist Problem and Mine, I drew on my personal experiences to expose the misrepresentations in the memoir this Watergate reporter had written about his communist childhood. The article has even more resonance today than it did when I wrote it, because it describes from the inside the milieu in which the 44th President of the United States also grew up, along with his chief advisors, David Axelrod and Valerie Jarrett. A series of attacks on the political right by the writer Michael Lind provided me with an opportunity to describe what a political conversion actually entails, and also to correct the distorted picture of the right that was becoming commonplace among its leftist opponents. I responded to Lind's defamation of conservatives in an article called Political Crossdresser. Time and again, as I attempted to describe my experiences as a radical, I encountered the resistance put up by leftists to any candor on the subject, their inability to face up to the past, and their penchant for rewriting it instead, still lying after all these years, and repressed memory syndrome are efforts to address this resistance to historical truth. I'm not referring here to differences in interpretation of what happened, but to the deliberate suppression of facts or inversion of facts in the service of a political cause. The article Fidel, Pinochet, and Me is another attempt to confront my former comrades with the results to which our political advocacies had led. In this article, I compare the achievements of Chile's dictator Augusto Pinochet, whom progressives loathed, to those of Cuba's dictator Castro, whom they adored and whose excesses they excused. Comparing those histories provided a measure of progressives' disconnect from reality in the service of a destructive illusion, and of their blindness to the human consequences of their ideas and actions. Shortly after publishing the article, I found myself on a radio show with Christopher Hitchens, who at the time was one of the radical harassers of the terminally ill Pinochet, calling for his arrest and extradition for crimes he had committed as Chile's dictator decades before. When I pointed out that Pinochet's dictatorship was no worse for Chileans than Castro's was for Cubans, and arguably a lot better, Christopher burst out on air. How dare you? How dare you? I was taken aback by this fervor, but replied in as amicable a tone as I could muster. Christopher, aren't we getting a little old for how dare yous? This was the first time Christopher and I had spoken in nearly 20 years, and it was to his credit that the next time we did, we became friends. It was a continuing source of fascination to me that progressives, who had been so demonstrably on the wrong side of history during the Cold War, were able to maintain their air of superiority when it was over, while simultaneously marginalizing conservatives in the academic and literary cultures they dominated. The essay Marginalizing Conservative Ideas is another facet of my ongoing effort to identify the differences between the two perspectives that led to two different outcomes. In the two articles, Can There Be a Decent Left? And The Left and the Constitution, I analyzed the nature of the left by engaging the ideas of two of its more intellectually interesting figures, Michael Walzer and Hendrik Hertzberg. Regrettably, neither one responded to these overtures, a not uncommon occurrence. The nature of the left is also the subject of 3 essays on neo-communism, which were written after the onset of the Iraq War, an American intervention vigorously opposed by almost the entire progressive spectrum, with notable but rare exceptions such as Hitchens and Paul Berman. The latter was steadily moving from his earlier positions and was no longer an antagonist of mine. That war proved to be a defining political crossroads, and I used the occasion to articulate my understanding of what the post-communist left shared with its communist precursors. The continuities of the left by now had become a central theme of my work. Neo-communism, a term I chose to characterize the left, failed to catch on, as I had suspected it would. This was a credit to leftist success in embargoing attempts to link them to their communist predecessors by associating their critics with problematic figures like Senator Joseph McCarthy. The very use of the word communist is taken to be evidence of McCarthyism, but the effect of accepting the preferred euphemisms such as progressive and liberal, a term applied by the New York Times even to card-carrying communists like Angela Davis, has had the dual effect of obscuring their agendas and burying the lessons of their past. The second volume of the series, Progressives, returns to these issues. The chapter Discover the Networks is the defense of an online encyclopedia of the left I created by that name, and a further attempt of mine to provide a taxonomy of the species. Keeping an eye on the domestic threat is a further explication of this database, and thus another inquiry into the nature of the faith. And that's the end of part 2. And one of the sections that I really want to comment on is about where he's talking about using progressive and liberal as a way of obscuring agendas and burying the lessons of their past. And that still continues today. That's why I don't like to refer to the socialists as liberals, and I will refer to them as socialists. I don't even like to quote what he's calling here progressives. No, to call somebody a progressive is to concede the point. Because if they're progressive and I oppose their policies, what does that make me by default? A regressive. So I always refer to them as Crowleyists, because Herbert Crowley is the guy that created this particular political movement based on such ideas as having the United States be one giant closed shop. In other words, every job would be a union job, and having the government run the economy so that, because Herbert Crowley claimed there was a promise to American life, and that promise was ever increasing prosperity, and that by being capitalists, and he hated the Constitution of the United States, but being constitutional and being capitalistic and having a gold standard, we were always going to have boom and bust cycles, and that somehow there was a promise of American life that my children are supposed to do better than I do, their children do better than them, etc., etc., etc. And the only way to make sure that that happens is by having the government intervene in the economy, which is where Keynesian economics came from, the kind of economy that the world is in right now, and it's been a huge failure. So, But next week is going to be part 3 of this. Let me see here. Part 3, part 4, which are very short. And then we'll actually get into part 3 and part 4 of his introduction. And then we actually get into part 1, reflections of my life, and chapter 1, left illusions. So um, on that note, we end another episode of Story Time. And until next time, I thank you very much for joining me and have a great day.